So this is going to be a review of both Chapter 5 and Chapter 6. Chapter 5 is incredibly long, so we're going to have to get straight into this. This chapter is extremely long. Like I said last week, I think, in my last review, it's something like 250 pages and a lot of shit goes down. But this is pretty much like the entire last half of the book. So we start off the chapter with the delivery man making his delivery to Pollution, aka Chalky or Mr. White, depending. It pretty much follows the show beat for beat, so there's not really anything new there to say. I do love, though, that the river in question in the scene is called the River Uck. I don't know why, I just find that so funny. Like, is there really a river in the UK called the Uck? After this, of course, he has to make the delivery to Death. In the show, I've had a couple of times where I'm like trying to figure out what exactly the note says about the delivery to Death. The only thing that I do know that the book explains that the show doesn't is that in the note of like where to deliver it, it just says everywhere. And apparently that is enough for the delivery man to know exactly how to deliver this properly. And so he does. And again, this follows pretty much with the show. One thing I do notice in the book that is different from the show is that I feel like Death is a little... saying he's more playful sounds weird, but I think he's a little like less severe than he is in the show. I know that that is kind of like a Terry Pratchett thing to make Death more personable, let's say. And that's something that definitely is true in this book, but doesn't really carry over into the show. Next up, we go to Shadwell getting Newt ready to go to Tadfield, and we also get to see the scene where Agnes dies or explodes. Agnes's last words are to look up at heaven and call presumably God a daft old fool, which I think is hilarious. It's explained later in the chapter who she's really talking to, but the fact that it looks like she's talking to God, I really enjoy. I kind of wish that had been kept in the show. Of course, after this, we get Newt running into the flying saucer. It is kind of a silly scene, and like the description of the alien kind of looking like, you know, they're wearing aluminum foil, as it were, as like part of their spacesuit is kind of silly, but I guess, you know, when your Antichrist is 11 years old and it's coming from his mind, that makes perfect sense. And then, of course, you know, we go to the them, who is arguing about witches again. Honestly, like, let's wrap it up, kids. This has been going on for like 2 chapters now. Like, how much more can you possibly have to say about witches? Like... And then, of course, you know, while they're arguing, Newt crashes the car. We see Anathema waiting. She already knows about all of this. I will say one of the things the book makes clear that the show doesn't entirely, I guess you could infer this, is like when Anathema meets Newt, she already knows that she's meant to be into him because of all of the prophecies and stuff like that. But when she sees him, she's just kind of disappointed. She's like, oh, okay, he's like not really all that, but whatever. And there's a line, I don't remember where it is in the chapter, but I know it's in my notes and it made me laugh. There's a line where she's basically like, you know, the good thing about spending the rest of your life with Newt is that it's not going to be very long. And the way it's said, she's specifically thinking his life isn't going to be very long, which implies she knows he's going to die sooner. But I'm assuming she has to mean, like, it's not going to last very long because it's the end of the world. But it's the way it sounds, it makes it sound like he's meant to die before her at some point. But I don't know, maybe I just read that wrong. It's me, so. I also love that at this point in the book, Anathema explains, or she kind of has this thought of like, she's been meaning to put all of these index cards into the computer so she can kind of cross-reference them more easily. It's interesting because like, at least in the show, she has like the alarm set for her prophecies, so like they pop up, which I think is kind of cool. And I do like that in the book they clearly created some kind of cross-referencing system to understand things in a historical context in a more modern context as well. Like to understand, I should say, to understand historical things in a more modern context. I think that's really amusing. At the same time, it probably would have been a lot easier if she had just put it on a computer. And mind you, this was in the 90s, so computers have gone so much further than what they were even at the time that this book came out. I remember in the early 2000s, there was like this CD-ROM that went out that was like, you could search any word in the Bible, or no, you could search anything, and like it would somehow, I didn't really understand the methodology, but it was like it would take the first letter of like every paragraph in the Bible and find out like your whole life or whatever. Like you could look up your life and it's like most people's names and lives and shit were like somewhere in the Bible. You just have to like, you know, triangulate it with some kind of math or whatever. It was like this whole big thing. If you remember that, please comment down below, because I feel like talking about it, I feel like that sounds like the ravings of a mad woman who read Dan Brown a little bit too much. But I know for a fact that was a thing that people were obsessed with. And it was like just this thing. I wish I could remember what it was called, but I do remember that it was a CD-ROM. So that tells you how old it was. It was like the early 2000s. That has nothing to do with anything, but this is what it made me, that's what the book made me think about, is like if she had put it onto the computer, it basically would have been that, just like, I don't know, 15 years before that happened. So of course after this, you know, we get back to Adam and the them. You kind of see him taking kind of a darker turn as he comes into his powers, which makes perfect sense. We see those kind of like dark internal thoughts that are making him become evil, let's say, or become a little more like the Antichrist that he's expected to be. I will say one of the things I really enjoy is that the book kind of gives you a little more idea of Dog and sort of even his own internal monologue as like a hellhound. You know, we get to see that he really doesn't want to go back to hell because it's boring and the taste of lost souls doesn't taste like anything. So he kind of wants to explore just being, I almost said a human dog, a dog in the human world. He wants to explore being a dog here. He doesn't want to have to go back to hell if Adam, you know, comes into his powers and makes everything end. So he's kind of sad about it, and he's scared by, you know, the hail that comes from Adam, which I think is really funny because like he's a hellhound, but he's also kind of a fraidy dog, which is cute to me for some reason. So I enjoyed that aspect of like getting to see that. We also see a scene from a completely like unrelated character to anything. I think he's like meant to be a construction worker or something. Like trees start coming up from the ground and just destroying this building because trees are just growing at will because Adam wants them to like take over the earth and like make it green again. It's kind of a random scene. I like the idea of the trees just coming out of nowhere and like destroying this whole building, but like it's so random and out of place, which is something that I kind of notice a lot in this book, is there's a lot of things that feel kind of like out of place and disjointed. Again, I guess too, it's a book, so, you know, books can be disjointed as a treat. We then get the scene where the Kraken comes up from the ocean. I do love the line that's said by God in the show and is actually in the book itself about a billion sushi dinners cry out for vengeance. I think that's such a funny line, especially because we know Aziraphale loves sushi, so I just feel like it's a personal attack on him. Like, Aziraphale found snatched. Like, that's just what it is. All those sushi dinners are coming back for you, girl. I'm so sorry. I love that in the book, of course, Agnes predicts that Anathema and Newt are going to get together. This is the opposite of Gay. I would like to skip this, please. And then we cut to Shadwell and him kind of, you know, the whole scene with the pin coming out of the wall. Okay, but finally, like 50 pages into this chapter or something, when we're seeing Shadwell again, we get a reference to the idea that makes it sound like only once did Crowley and Aziraphale visit Shadwell's flat together. It might have just been that they both visited on 2 separate occasions, but it made it sound like they visited together, which I just think is the funniest idea on earth. I also love the idea that Aziraphale is explained as trying to touch absolutely nothing in the flat because, of course, like, would you? Love how he just naturally assumes that Crowley is a part of the mafia, and then also assumes that Aziraphale is a Russian spy, but is like, yeah, I'm still gonna try and shake him down for some money, which is how he ends up going to the bookshop. I just love the idea that you think someone's a Russian spy, but you're less scared of them than the mafia? I don't know. I don't know what that is. So then, of course, we go to Aziraphale. I love the line in this scene because he says he ought to tell Crowley about Adam and all of that. And then he says, no, I ought to tell Heaven, but he wants to tell Crowley because they've been friends for 6,000 years and he feels like they have more in common with each other than with their respective head offices, which of course we know to be true. But I really like seeing actually stated in the book, because one of the things that I find so frustrating about the show, like if you want to talk differences between the book and the show, the thing that I find the most frustrating is that like it feels like with Aziraphale in the show, he takes 2 steps forward in realizing that Heaven is bullshit and like 12 steps back in like almost every episode. And it's like, buddy, why are we doing this? Why are you always taking 2 steps forward, 10 steps back? Like, can you just keep moving forward? Can we just do that? Please? You need to know that Heaven is not good for you, sweetie. I've said this before, but like Heaven is like an abusive ex that Aziraphale just can't seem to leave. And I feel like in the book, it makes it seem like he's definitely better at kind of noticing that. But for some reason in the show, he just like keeps going back and keeps going back. And it's like, girl, when are we gonna stop perpetuating this cycle? Like, it's so frustrating in the show. But that's, again, a whole other thing. I do love one difference between the show and the book that I really, really love is that when Aziraphale decides to create the portal to talk to Heaven when he ends up speaking to the Metatron, it says in the book that he lights incense, not because it does anything, but just because it creates a fun ambiance and smells nice. I just think that's funny. I love the idea that he's like kind of like just given witchy vibes with the incense. He's like, it doesn't do anything, but it's fun. I love him so much. Like, can I just say that? I just love him so much. It's just like the scene in the show where he ends up talking to the Metatron. He's trying to explain that, you know, there doesn't have to be a war. He knows how to get a hold of Adam and kind of how to fix everything. The Metatron's just like, yeah, no, that's not going to happen. The point of the war is to win it. And Aziraphale, I feel like, again, in the book, he just seems more realistic about it. And just like in the show, I love that when he calls Crowley, he gets his answering machine. And it's clearly the first time he's ever gotten his answering machine because he has no earthly idea that it's his answering machine, which I just find so funny. So in the show, when Aziraphale gets Crowley's answering machine, he's like, I know who you are, you idiot. I just called you. I love that in the book, he's like talking through the answering machine thing, and then the answering machine beeps and he goes, stop making noises at me. I'm just like, I cannot with you. You're so adorable. Like, again, he's never heard his answering machine, so of course he doesn't know what it sounds like because Crowley always answers his calls. But I just find that so funny to be like, stop making noise. Like, do you really think Crowley's just sitting there like, beep? And like, can he make such a noise? Like, at least I'm having fun. That's what matters. And then of course, you know, we get Shadwell interrupting everything. I love that the only response Crowley has when he does pick up the phone is just like a, when he realizes it's Aziraphale. It's like, that's your husband, you brat. Be nice. Like, and I know, I get it, because he's going to get in trouble because there's a demon there, but I'm just like, I do, of course, love, you know, we get the line that's in the book and the show, which is Aziraphale saying, I think perhaps you've got the wrong shop. It's so fucking funny. It's so good. And then I love that the first time he swears in the book, he actually swears twice. He first says bugger, which is said that it's the first time he sweared in 6,000 years. Sweared? It's the first time he's sworn in 6,000 years, which I think is funny. And then when he gets discorporated, obviously he says, oh fuck. So it's the second time in like 5 minutes he's sworn. And I'm like, oop. he's got a mouth on him today. But you know what? It's the end of the world, so I think you are due a little swearing. I also love that in the book that when they describe Crowley's flat, they explain that the look of it is unlived in because it is unlived in. I mean, obviously, because he's clearly just always with Aziraphale at the bookshop. Like, they do explain he comes there like at the end of the day, so like he sleeps there, obviously. But like, it's just kind of funny to me that clearly he really spends most of his time with Aziraphale, I have to assume. They also explain that he's got a lot of like modern technology, which I find funny. He has a laser disc player, which is like such a short-lived before DVDs thing, but it's just modern enough to be funny to me. So I love that. I love that he has a CD collection that isn't just Queen. Like, he has other music that he likes, which is funny. And I also like the idea that he apparently keeps stocked gourmet food in his fridge that's like always stocked, never goes bad. And like, we know for a fact he doesn't eat, so I have to assume it's just there in the off chance Aziraphale ever shows up. Like, that's the only thing I can assume from that. I do love that here we get the line about Crowley putting the fear of God, or more specifically the fear of Crowley, into his plants. I swear I remember somewhere in the book, and maybe because the one thing is, I have not been reading I know throughout the book there's like little footnotes and annotations. I read them the first time. In an ebook, they're not really easy to read, footnotes and annotations, because they're going to take you to the very, very end of the book. And so it's like, I'm not trying to like figure out how to get back to where I was within the book. Like, ebooks, I think, need to do better about footnotes and annotations, because right now they're really poorly done and it's too frustrating. I'm like, I'm not going to click on that. So technically speaking, I know somewhere, and maybe it was in the footnotes, it does imply that Crowley didn't really kill his plants, but it never says so anywhere explicitly in the book. But I do remember that very distinctly. There's so many things that I feel like I remember distinctly in my first read through of the book that, like, this time around, I'm not seeing those things, and I'm just like, did I read a different book? Like, I don't know what's going on. But there's like a few different things where I'm just like, I remember this description of something in the book originally, and now it's not here. So I feel like I'm like losing my mind trying to remember this. So now, one of the other big differences is that when Hell announces that they're going to come after Crowley for messing up the whole thing with the Antichrist, he is actually in his flat when that happens, even though he's in a movie theater when it happens in the show. I think it kind of makes more sense for it to have happened in his flat, gives him more time to prepare. I also love the idea that the description of how Hastur and Ligor get to his flat is that they drive, or they appear to be driving, but like the car's wheels don't move, and like it's just so funny and weird the way they describe that scene. I love the idea of Hastur and Ligor attempting to drive. I just think it's so silly, but also so funny. I also enjoy that in this scene where he's putting the holy water into the bucket, it's very tense. He hears one of his neighbors screams, and he happens to know exactly who it is, which I think is kind of sweet, because it implies maybe he knows his neighbors a little bit. I don't appreciate the fact that Hastur feels the need to dead name Crowley in this scene, which I'm like, excuse me, sir, rude. I get you're a demon, but you don't have to do all that. There's this one line that's in the book that I really, really enjoy, that I feel like kind of is the biggest separating point between how the show handles everything and how the book handles, you know, the angels versus demons thing. I really, really love this line. I'm going to put it in the over here, but it's basically like Crowley will tell you, you know, demons for important function, almost like tax accountants, and there's plenty of demons who, like himself, are not that evil, but you know, there's plenty of angels who are rat bastards, and of course we see that all throughout the show. And then of course, you know, he goes on to talk about how Hastur and Ligor are just a special case. They get pleasure out of evil. Ligor, of course, dies. It's a very quick scene. And then he's like disappointed because Hastur got none of the holy water. I feel like realistically with the bucket, it probably seems like it would be both of them who got splashed, but somehow Hastur gets nothing. Clearly he was just back far enough. One line that I find particularly funny is it says that after Ligor dies, Crowley feels like he has slightly, you know, it's slightly more even, but not quite, because Hastur is a Duke of Hell and Crowley is not even a local counselor. I think that's just so funny as a line. I also love that in this scene, Hastur is like trying to scare Crowley, and he decides that his like demonic words won't work, so he just tells him he's going to be taken to the cleaners, pal, which is such a funny thing to imagine a demon saying. Like, just, you're going to get taken to the cleaners, pal. Just like, what? And I do love, of course, you know, as Crowley jumps into the phone line, we do get the explanation that we get in the show about how, you know, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, and that the only angel who really dances is Aziraphale, who dances the gavotte in a discreet gentleman's club in Portland Place in the 1880s. That follows exactly from the show. It's such a, to me, it's like, it's a very, very, very obviously queer line. Like, there's no getting around that. Discreet gentleman's club in the 1880s, like, come on, we know what that's about. But I do love the line. I do love that it's included. I will say, in terms of like information being, you know, given to us, it does feel very like apropos of nothing, both in the book and in the show. I will say one thing I enjoyed about the full line about Aziraphale dancing the gavotte is that it's actually talking about provided he has a suitable partner who can, you know, dance on the head of a pin with him, and that the dance is the gavotte. It's a straightforward one. I do feel like he does have a partner that he could do that. And so I'd like sometime in season 3 for Aziraphale to teach him the gavotte. That's what I'm saying there. So then, of course, you know, we see Shadwell going to Madame Tracy's flat. He passes out in her bed. And then, of course, we see the moment where Crowley goes to the bookshop and sees that it's on fire after Aziraphale got discorporated. He is very sad about it and feels kind of lost, and he's, you know, grimy and scared and all of that. But like, in general, obviously, it's a lot more emotional in this show. I think it's played up a lot better. I think the musical cues in the show kind of add to the sadness of it. I do love that he, you know, curses Aziraphale and heaven and hell just for good measure. I think that's kind of like a funny little moment. I will say, so we cut to the Four Horsemen when they arrive to the cafe. I do love the idea that in the book, Wars, or actually all of their jackets say Hell's Angels. I think that's really funny. We see, of course, Death playing his little trivia game. He's kind of found like a posse by accident of just bikers who want to see what he's doing and tell him the answers. And I love that one of them is regarding the death of Elvis, and they're like, no, Elvis died this time. And Death just turns around and goes, I don't care what that says. I didn't lay a finger on him. I just find that so funny. I love the idea that Death is like, look, I didn't do it, so you can't say he's really dead. I also love the idea that with these bikers, the one who sees Death is like, oh, hey, you're on the album cover of a band that I like, and also on this ring that I own. And Death is just like, yeah, whatever, I get around. Now, one of the biggest differences in the book versus the show is that Aziraphale actually tries possessing a couple of people before he gets to Madame Tracy. So in one of the scenes, he tries possessing, he ends up possessing a man who is in Australia. You know, he doesn't know where he is. He's trying to ask around. The guy's like, because of course, we can't go more than a few pages without someone calling Aziraphale some type of slur. This poor angel cannot catch a break. I swear to God. It's kind of ridiculous. But yeah, he's basically, this Australian guy calls him a name and he's like, oh, okay, I think I know where I am now. I'm gonna leave. And he leaves this guy. So next we see that he possesses someone in Haiti. From what I kind of gathered from the book itself, and then I later talked to one of my good friends who happens to be of Haitian descent themselves, it has been kind of made clear that it's loosely, you know, kind of like a voodoo priest is what this person that Aziraphale possesses is supposed to be. And he does ask a question in French that I had to look up because I didn't know what it meant. And I also kind of sent it to this friend who kind of explained it more to me. Basically, the literal translation of what he asks is Aziraphale his big good angel? Which, in my head, I took a different way, especially because of Aziraphale's response. But basically what he's asking is like, are you my conscience? Which I think is, you know, that makes sense as a question. But I love the idea that Aziraphale's answer is, that's kind of a personal question. I mean, I do the best that I can, all things considered, but like, I just think it's so funny, his reaction, because I'm like, if someone's asking if you're their conscience, why why is that his reaction? Because when I first read this and I read that the question was, are you my big good angel? I took it from, oh, okay. His reaction is like, this angel has a praise kink a mile long. We've seen that. So that's where I took that. But then to realize it's asking if he's his conscience, I feel like the answer that Aziraphale gives doesn't make as much sense, but like, it does make sense in the last thing he says before he leaves this voodoo priest, which is he tells him to be good. I guess that would make sense for your conscience to tell you to be good. Again, this is another scene where it's like, does it age the best? Probably not. There's probably a reason that this wasn't included in the show. Yeah, it's in the book, so there you go. The third person Aziraphale possesses is probably my favorite, and this is the one I do wish had been in the show because I think it's the absolute funniest thing. So before he gets to Madame Tracy, he ends up possessing a pastor of like a mega church in Nebraska. So funny. Like, I can't even begin to tell you because, the pastor is talking about the end of days, and Aziraphale is like, hold on a second. That's not what it's going to be like, number one. And number two, actually, all of that we're going to win and be so great is actually just propaganda. We have a 50-50 shot. Because again, it's that moment that I was talking about earlier in this video where I feel like in the book, Aziraphale seems to understand that, heaven and hell probably aren't as different as they seem or as different as they would like to portray themselves as. Good and bad, it's a little more complicated than that. And I think Crowley is proof that it's more complicated than that. And so I do like that in the book, he's kind of like, look, we've got a 50-50 shot. We don't know who's going to win. Otherwise, what would even be the point of doing any of this in the first place? Which makes perfect sense to me. I will say I love that the preacher initially thinks he's possessed by a demon, and Aziraphale's like, no, nothing could be further from the truth. And then at the last moment when he's about to leave, he looks around and notices a camera person. He's like, oh gosh, I'm on TV, aren't I? I just think that's so funny. And that's so Aziraphale too. Like, I could picture him saying that in the show, like, oh gosh, I'm on TV. And just like, kind of adjusting himself, sitting up a little straighter. He's just our adorable little baby. But I also love that he was like not taking this pastor shit. He was like, no, we're not doing this. This is not what's happening. Nobody's getting raptured. He's like, do you really think angels have time to rapture you people? Like, I just think that's so funny that he's like, no, that's not how it's going to happen. So of course, we cut then to Crowley doing 120 on Oxford Street. He's very depressed. He's very sad. He ends up trying to read Agnes Nutter's book while he's driving. And so we do kind of get the confirmation that the Bentley can very much drive itself and does drive itself. It shifts gears once or twice in this scene. I do kind of love though that like he decides in order to get out of the city, he has to like drive on the sidewalk a little bit of the ways, and then he also drives through the River Thames. I think that would have been more interesting if that had been in the show too. I also love the idea that through doing this, even though this car can clearly drive itself, it still ends up getting dented and busted as he's driving it through the sidewalk. I'm like, how did this happen? It's so weird to me. So at one point, Crowley is listening to the radio. It's interrupted by hell, in which they are threatening him yet again, telling him that what happens to him is going to be the stuff of legend, and people, parents will tell it to their kids to scare them. I think that's like really tragic. And I really hate too that he's described as being like tired and sad and scared, but also angry because, hell treats him the way he treats his plants, which I think kind of gives you a deeper insight into why he treats his plants the way he does. And it's kind of depressing actually when you come at it that way, that like this is his outlet of like how to communicate with his plants because this is all he's known. And it's like, you poor baby. I also feel like the only kindness that Crowley has known for a long, long time is clearly Aziraphale. And we know how that goes because sometimes he's a little shit too. So the four horsemen of the apocalypse kind of adopt these Hell's Angels who come with them for like the beginning part of their trip. I just think that's such a funny idea. And they're all trying to come up with what their name should be since, you know, there's war, famine, pollution, and death. So they're trying to come up with their own names of what they would be the horsemen of. And they're doing this while on the freeway. Of course, at long last, we get to Aziraphale finding Madame Tracy. That follows pretty much with, you know, what happens in the show. We do get to see Madame Tracy's real name being Marjorie Potts, which isn't explained in the show at all. I guess because it's not really that important, but it is just kind of funny. And I also love the idea that Madame Tracy decides to make 2 teas, one for herself and one for Aziraphale. And Aziraphale says he doesn't want sugar in his, which is so mind-boggling to me. So then we go back to Shadwell in Madame Tracy's bed, and he's having a dream about the death of Agnes Nutter. And I really enjoy the fact that it's only in this dream that he kind of realizes, oh, that's actually a really awful way to die. And I think he starts to kind of feel guilty about it, although it doesn't seem to make too much of a difference to him. But I also love the idea that actually the person that Agnes Nutter was shouting at when she died in the 1600s was actually Shadwell, who was dreaming, watching from above her. So she saw into his dream, which is wild to me. I just think that's such a funny concept. I also think it's really funny that when Shadwell learns that Madame Tracy is possessed by Aziraphale, he says specifically the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah. So it's like, yet again, there is this thing where Shadwell is, you know, calling him names. You know, it's like, buddy, what are we doing here? Why does everyone always have to call him, like, was it not enough to suggest that he's gayer than a tree full of monkeys on nitrous oxide? Did we really have to get every single other character calling him names too? Like, oh my god, please give this angel a break. I will say, I do enjoy the fact that Aziraphale does still call himself the Southern Pansy, because it does feel like, you know what, he's taking back his power. He's like, you know what, you've called me names, and guess what, I can take that power back for myself. Thank you very much. I do also love that he, when explaining everything to Shadwell about, you know, possessing Madame Tracy, that he makes an exorcist joke. I think that's so funny. I love the idea that he has seen that movie, and in my head, I love the idea that he and Crowley watch that movie and make fun of it religiously, because I just think that's so funny. I also love the line that when Aziraphale has to lie to Shadwell to get him to like convince him that he needs to kill the Antichrist, and tells him that he's got a ton of nipples, that he actually has the thought about the road to hell being paved with good intentions. I just think that's so funny. As I mentioned earlier, of course, it's raining fish in this scene, and it doesn't seem, or when we get back to the M25 or the freeway, it does seem to be, it's raining fish. That doesn't seem like it has anything to do with anything until we see that the other 4 horse people who are following the main 4 horsemen try and follow them as they go over this, like, car that like broke down, or this truck that broke down, so they just fly over it, and then the other 4 horsemen that are with them think, oh, we're gonna just go over this too. And of course 3 of them die. One of them does survive, but I don't remember if we see what happens to him after he gets taken away in an ambulance. I do love that while he's driving, Crowley has the idea that he kind of wants to go to a restaurant and wait out the end of the world and just drink until it's all over. But what keeps him going is, of course, the line that he is ultimately an optimist and believes that the universe will take care of him, which I do think makes sense. He did kind of create the universe and create the nebula, so it does make sense that he would think that the universe would ultimately have his back. Then we go back to Adam and the them. There's the whole scene where Adam, you know, starts to feel guilty about what he's saying, because he hears himself and what he's saying to his friends, and he starts to feel guilty about it. And that's ultimately what makes him realize, like, okay, being a jerk, this is not who I want to be. And so, you know, it has that sound that he lets out, his kind of scream that, like, somehow just, I don't know, releases the antichristness of him. And so it's still kind of there like a shadow, but like it's not enough that it's taking him over. He can control it now. We also cut back to Crowley, who's trying to keep his car together, which is making his eyes turn red and his teeth clench, and he's trying to remember not to breathe. Then of course we cut back to the them, who are talking about their rival gang. This is something that comes up very briefly throughout the book. It never comes up specifically in the show, obviously. Basically the conversation is they're talking about their rival gang. They're trying to see, you know, would life be better if they didn't have this rival gang? And the conclusion that they all come to is that things wouldn't be as interesting. So it's kind of like a metaphor of like heaven and hell. Like if one didn't exist, would life be better for everyone? But no, it wouldn't be as interesting if they didn't exist. Like, you know, good has to exist, evil has to exist. One cannot exist without the other. I do love the idea that once Crowley crosses the Ring of Fire and everyone sees him cross the Ring of Fire, they're so horrified by it that the MI5, MI6, a bomb squad, and the CIA are all called out to figure out how the hell he did that and why. I just find that such a funny like moment, because you're just like, that seems like such an overreaction, but also makes perfect sense. I also love that apparently at this point in time, the atmosphere is like 100 degrees below, 120 or something like that, below 0 Fahrenheit. They say it's something like -700 Celsius, which does not sound right to me mathematically. Maybe I read that wrong. I also like that they see Madame Tracy, Aziraphale, and Shadwell flying over the Ring of Fire, and they're just kind of like, oh, okay, I'm gonna pretend I didn't see that. Thanks. I do love getting to see everyone run into R.P. Tyler, because obviously in the book we see Four Horsemen running into R.P. Tyler, and then we also see Crowley running into him. But it turns out that Madame Tracy and Shadwell also run into him along with Aziraphale, because I don't enjoy his character, but I do think it's like really weird how we kind of get his perspective for a minute and how he feels about all of this. One thing that I think is really interesting, and it's another moment where a line from season 2 was in the book first. There's a line in the book where they talk about how humans are like bees and very protective of their hive, but once you get in, you're set. And Crowley later says this line in the second season, but he's talking about heaven. So I do think that is kind of an interesting like parallel. So everyone converges on the air base. You know, there's another line and scene and moment here which does not age particularly well. I will not be repeating it. You can look it up in the book if you are so inclined. But suffice it to say, there's a couple of things that really don't age well throughout this book. I will say when Crowley's car does fall apart, in the book, he doesn't seem like too sad about it. You know, he obviously says, you know, you won't get that kind of performance out of a modern car. He is, I think, somewhat sad about it, but he also just kind of is like, meh, what are you gonna do? So I think that is kind of an interesting change. I do love that when Aziraphale is trying to get Crowley to sort out the army man, he goes, sort him out, Crowley, that's a dear chap. I just think that's so funny of a line. And then Crowley's like, what? And Aziraphale's like, ugh, okay, fine. You're going to make me do the dirty work. I try and do the nice thing. And then he just sends him away. I do also think it's very funny that in the book, when some army men approach Crowley and Aziraphale and all of them on a jeep, Crowley decides he's going to fight them and takes like a, you know, karate stance, which I find so fucking funny. It's like, you're a demon. You don't have to do all that. Then, of course, all of them kind of give up the jeep, and that's how they get the jeep where they drive to meet up with them and the Four Horsemen. I will say one of the things that I enjoy in the book that's a little bit different is that them specifically have like their own kid versions of the accessories that the Four Horsemen have. So like Pepper has a wooden sword to go along with War's flaming sword. And then they have a crown that's made of like branches, and they have, I can't remember what the scales are made out of. I think it's like, you know, fishing line or whatever. But, you know, they have their own kid versions, and that's how they face off with the Four Horsemen. I do think it's kind of funny that when Adam sees Crowley and Aziraphale, he like looks at Crowley and looks through him, and Crowley is just like, oh shit, I'm in trouble. I think that's so funny. And just like in the show, he makes Madame Tracy and Aziraphale two separate people. I kind of love that for whatever reason, when they do that, Madame Tracy looks at Aziraphale and she's like, oh, I kind of thought you'd be younger. I'm like, that's so shady. Like, what? Why was that necessary? Like, as I'm telling you, Aziraphale cannot catch a break in this book. Everyone keeps like throwing shade at this poor angel. It's so sad. Please, someone show him some love. Crowley, I'm looking at you. I will say one of the biggest changes, of course, from the show and the book is that actually it's the Metatron who comes down along with Beelzebub, not Gabriel. Could you imagine if they had done that in the show and it was the Metatron and Beelzebub instead of Gabriel and Beelzebub? I don't ship it either way, so. I do kind of love that while Adam and Beelzebub are having a conversation, Crowley and Aziraphale are just in the background having their own conversation. Like, it's so like husband coded to me. It's so like they're just, you know, in the background having their own conversation. I find that so funny. And then of course, you know, we see Aziraphale piping up about the great plan versus the ineffable plan. And then, you know, yet again, Crowley starts talking with him and they start having, you know, this back and forth banter. Like, oh, maybe it's written different somewhere. Oh, you know, maybe this. And it's just like the husband strike again. I don't know what to tell you. Like, it's so cute, their little banter. I kind of wish we had gotten that a little bit more in the show. I get they were trying to make it a little more intense, a little more climactic. I get that. I understand why they did that. I will say the whole scene, the whole end scene in the book is a little less tense and climactic than it is in the show. Obviously, you know, we see that Satan is like implied to be coming, but I don't think he ever gets out of the ground. We never actually see him. So it's just kind of like this moment of like, he's coming, you get this sense of him, but we never actually see him. He doesn't say anything. So it's so much different from the show in that respect. I will say one of my all-time favorite lines, and this will go down as at least the second favorite queerest line in the show, is Crowley and Aziraphale are asking if it's all over after the Metatron and Beelzebub go back to their respective offices. And Adam goes, you two don't need to worry. I know all about you two. And I'm just sitting there like, what did you mean by that, Adam? Adam, explain yourself. What does that mean? You know all about the two of them. Like, what? What is happening? Why did we not get that in the show? Like, that would have been so iconic. That is the one thing that I will die on this hill that I'm upset that didn't get included in the show. Because what a slay of a line. Could you imagine if with everything we saw in the show, with how much they really pushed to make it more obviously queer, could you imagine if Adam had said that in the show? Where he's like, don't worry about it, I know all about you two. And I'd be like, bitch, what? What do you know? What have you heard? And then Aziraphale would deny it, because that's just what this show is. Actually, what I do love is, like, in the book, after, you know, Beelzebub and the Metatron go away, they're kind of all planning to go their separate ways. Aziraphale wants to take Anathema and Newt and Shadwell and Madame Tracy to dinner to, like, thank them for all their help. And then it's like, oh, actually, no, Satan's coming now. So it's like, oh, oopsie, Satan's coming. Whoop. I just think that's so funny because it's kind of like an afterthought almost. And then I also love that originally Crowley is like, okay, we need to get the fuck out of here then if Satan's coming, because that's not going to end well. And Aziraphale's like, come on, no, we owe it to them. We have to stay. What have you really got to lose? And Crowley's like, you know what? You're right. I've got nothing to lose, so fuck it. I am going to face down Satan and, you know, he's going to fuck around and find out. When they're about to face off against Satan and they're kind of like saying their goodbye, that's the moment where we get the, like, there's a little bit of good in you that Aziraphale says to Crowley, and Crowley says that you're just enough of a bastard to be worth liking. In the book, that's what he says. It's a very distinct difference to say worth liking versus worth knowing. I'll let you decide which one is more impactful. I know for me, knowing is more impactful, especially, you know, when you get into knowing in the biblical sense. We've talked about this in previous videos. So, I mean, honestly, again, like I said, the showdown with Satan really isn't that much in the show. They kind of like prepare for it, and then Mr. Young comes in his car and everything just kind of dissolves. I do like that in the book, the next time after all of that, when we see Crowley and Aziraphale having their wine and having their conversation about about whether or not God planned it this way. They're still on the tarmac when that happens, and then the International Express man comes in to get everything. And I also love that, as in the show, it turns out that Aziraphale was just sitting on the flaming sword for an hour and didn't notice. I'm not going to say anything. I do think it's really cute because it kind of ends the chapter with Crowley holding out his hand for Aziraphale and inviting him to take him home. They end up going home on the Jeep and nobody really questions it instead of the bus. They get to listen to kind of like soft music, and it doesn't turn into Queen because of course it's not the Bentley, so it wouldn't. I think that's really kind of cute. I like how it ends that chapter with the two of them. So this is going to be the last chapter. This is going to be chapter 6. So chapter 6 pretty much, it follows mostly the end of the last episode of the show. You know, we see Newt and Anathema kind of together. They wake up, or actually Newt wakes up first and he's like trying to make breakfast, and that's when the lawyer comes out, or I guess he was a lawyer, wasn't he? The person who comes over with the new set of prophecies. So we see that in the book. I think that's very interesting. We then cut to Aziraphale and Crowley in St. James Park. They're talking about how everything is the same except for some new editions of books that were included by Adam in the bookshop, which I think is so funny, especially because they're like kids' books. I will say, I really enjoy in the book where Crowley says that anybody who could create a universe in 6 days didn't actually need for the whole demons and heaven and hell thing to happen, but they clearly wanted it to happen. The biggest difference, of course, between the show and the book is that their whole heavenly and hell trials never happen in the book. They kind of just, you know, have their meeting in St. James Park, and then they do end up having dinner at the Ritz, and it's, you know, a very cozy moment. They do talk about the nightingale singing in Berkeley Square, but ultimately, like, that's kind of where that goes. I will say one thing that I really enjoyed that the book added that the show didn't is that we get to see Warlock and what happens to him. And I like that it's actually he's going to America. And then we also see Greasy Johnson, who again is part of Adam's rival gang, who has a photography magazine but ends up seeing an article in that magazine about American football and how it's taking over in England. Now, the way I took this scene is that they're implying that Greasy Johnson is actually the third child. I know that earlier in the book, I think it does follow the show where it's like, it's nice to think that the nuns kind of had him adopted off. But the way the book implies it, because they say something about, you know, the friends you make even when you're 3 hours old. And the fact that he's mentioned in the same context as Warlock, who we know was the other baby, kind of implies to me that maybe Greasy Johnson being this, like, maybe he was the one who was adopted out. He was the third baby who was adopted out. That's kind of how the book seems to imply it, if I'm understanding that correctly. You know, we get to see Adam stealing the apple from R.P. Tyler's garden, and that's kind of the last scene we get in the show. Excuse my cat just deciding to enter here. And that was, you know, that's all she wrote. That's the whole book. As far as my final thoughts go, I would say my final thoughts are ultimately, I am glad I reread this book. It's been a long time. There's a lot I didn't remember. Obviously, you know, again, there's a lot that didn't age well. It's mostly the same as the show, like I said. I think the biggest difference in, like, overall my thoughts would be the show is very unapologetically queer, as I've said before, and I think the book is kind of queer in spite of itself, if that makes sense. There's a lot of moments that are very openly queer, very clearly, you know, if you know where to look for it, it is. But I think it's kind of a little bit in spite of itself. It's kind of a little bit that way, not necessarily intentionally. It seems to be maybe a little less intentional than it is in the show. It's very clearly intentional in the show, and in the book it's kind of like just, it's there if you know where to look for it, which I think is kind of very true of the time period as well. I would love to know for anyone who was reading along with me, because I do know there were quite a few people who said that they wanted to read along with me. I want to know, what was your favorite part of these last 2 chapters? What did you think of it overall? I guess that's kind of it. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to like this video, comment down below, just tell me your thoughts. Tell me, were you reading along with me? Did you enjoy this? And of course, if you enjoyed this video, please feel free to subscribe to this channel. I just recently passed 1,000 subscribers. I'm so unbelievably excited and so unbelievably grateful. This is such a huge deal for me. And if you enjoy these videos or any of my content, you can also subscribe to me over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/NarcissaDeVille. That is my members only channel where I post behind the scenes content or sometimes extended videos for some of my videos where I ramble on just a little too much. And until next time, stay devilish and see you next Tuesday.